Target, so let's go. Tonight is second lecture. The name of the series is Hubris and Atonement, the State of Israel and the Jewish People, 1972 to 75. It's years we're covering. Tonight is the second lecture called Promises Unfulfilled, the Arab World in the 1970s. Start, as always, by thanking Shomri Amuna for hosting us over here. It's very nice. And for the Lehmann family for being the lecture series, the main sponsors. I think David and Pam, I believe, were in Italy. I want to thank tonight's sponsors, of course, as you can see, which in memory of late Esti Samuel, passed away not long ago. I say with sadness, although I should be sitting right about over there. Succumbed to a tragic illness, and among other was a very good friend of mine and of theirs, obviously, and many of us. And only in tonight's context, I say that she was always one of our sponsors. So she is indeed missed in many ways. And if I want to really be tug at the heartstrings, she gave me a whole spiel. She was in the Yom Kippur War in the Army. Okay, so, but anyway, so I want to thank tonight's sponsors over there. I still need, we have about half covered, so I need sponsors for another 9 or so talks. That's a bunch. So anybody that can help, obviously you're helping everyone else over here, and enabling everybody to just walk in whenever they want, as we do, without us putting gatekeepers and things like that. So I do hope that those who can will. And it'll save me, as I always say, the problem of having to stand up here and do this. But anyway, that's where things stand. So we have about half covered, Baruch Hashem, and we need the other half covered, and that's you all. I do have this Israel trip I'm still working at. As I mentioned, I talked about it last week. And we have a bunch of people, thank God, but we want more if we can. And it will be quite a remarkable trip. If you look on my website, the Shul website, you'll see all the itinerary if you're really interested in all the details. You can imagine, Mark and I put a lot of thought into it, but it'll be an action-packed trip. I know that any of you, I look around here, some of you have been to my other trips, so you can tell the others. I do want to point out now, finally, I'm getting my website together, so if you look at Rabbi David Katz, you'll find a lot of the old lectures on there. And finally, I want to thank, as I always do, all our technical crew here, our experts who make this happen week after week. Without them, you wouldn't be hearing the words I'm saying right now, so thank you, especially to them. You all really deserve a round of applause. No one is taken for granted by me. And now I'll get down to work. Tonight, as I say, we're talking about the Arab side, because my friends, Israel, nobody asked me. He says, what the guy say, had I been present at the creation, I would have offered helpful hints for the proper ordering of the universe. But since I wasn't asked, the good Lord decided to stick Israel, not as the Israelis say, in New Zealand, far away from everybody else, but smack in the middle of the Arab world, in the Middle East, okay? And as we know so famously, let's go past here, as John Donne told us, no man's an island, all part of the continent, darn it. And so Israel has to, as we all know, live in a sea of non-Israelis. So it behooves us to know what's going on by Yemen, okay? Because we're not talking things happening far away, but immediately next door. And I've, every year, tried to bring the Arab perspective and understanding what's happening among the huge Arab world, growing all the time, in order to understand the dynamics that so powerfully affect Israel, obviously. I will remind you that the second half of the 20th century, which is where we're at, was the first time in 1,000 years that the Arabs had ruled themselves. Perhaps you forget that. The great Muslim leaders of the past you heard about were not Arabs. Saladin was a Kurd from Kurdistan. Suleiman the Magnificent was a Turk who conquered his father, Selim, conquered the Arabs. Suleiman conquered Iraq. Mehmed Ali, who made Egypt into a semi-modern state, was Albanian. And King Farouk is his great-grandson. So in other words, wherever you go, 100 years ago, in the Arab world, the rulers are not Arabs. They're Muslims, which is a big difference, obviously. But is a certain type of colonialism, Islamic colonialism, if you wish to use that term. The Arabs haven't ruled themselves since, I don't know, the 900s or something like that, so really 1,000 years. Long, long, long ago, they lost control of their own empire to other ethnicities. They were Muslim, I'll repeat. And so that, sort of complicated things, like, are you being ruled by a foreigner, not by a foreigner? And the rulers often used Arabic language and culture, so, it's funny. But in terms of being Arab, that was in the 600s, in the 700s, and in the 800s, and sort of petered out in the 900s. That was their time. And then, of course, came the 20th century, when all the new nationalisms popped up. However, instead of the Arabs in the Middle East doing what other ethnicities and nationalities did, which is uniting and successfully rising and throwing off the Ottoman oppression and establishing their own state, which would be the scenario the way they would like to have with their own George Washington, and they kick out the foreign rulers, and the righteous thing of the Arab masses and all that. Instead, stuff happened, okay? Lawrence of Arabia, and the Versailles Treaty, and General Allenby, and the British. In other words, the Arabs didn't defeat the Turkish Empire, the British did. And they did so in collusion with the French, so after the war, as I think everybody knows, the British and French kind of carved up, for a very short time, it turns out, however, the Middle East. And if you're an Arab, that's weird. That's not the way the story's supposed to go. The way the story's supposed to go is Prince Faisal or somebody like that organized all the tribes in Saudi Arabia, generate support, as he enjoyed, throughout all the different parts of the Arab world, Damascus and Jerusalem and back in place like that. As I say before, in some movie, the Arabs somehow or other kick out the Turks, which they were incapable of doing. They were not capable because Turkey, believe it or not, had a modern military. And then triumphantly establishing an Arab state in the right way. That movie did not happen, okay? So instead, you ended up with the famous Rube Goldberg map, right? Where the League of Nations didn't give the Arabs really any time of the day. They went through the motions. And by the time it's over, as we all know, Palestine and Iraq, look, that's a lot of territory, was given to British as a colony or a mandate. And Syria and Lebanon was given to the French. And the what you and I call Saudi Arabia was divided up in funny ways, but the Saudi prince killed everybody and took over, what we call today Saudi Ibn Saud. Then you got your Yemen over here, and the British have a colony over here, what do you call it, Aden, and what do you call it, then you have some of these sultanates, which are half British control here. In other words, a Rube Goldberg map. If you're a real Arab, I want you to understand this. That's not the way it's supposed to look. It's supposed to be one big blotch of red or green or whatever, and that's our country. And it's called the Middle East, or it's called the Kingdom of Arabia or something like that. And it has many provinces, and everybody's Arab. And we all live happily ever after. And I might point out that that country that I just described would have a ton of oil. Agreed? So it'd be a rich country, and no one would tell them what to do with their oil. And so they could build up once again, as they envisioned it, a brilliant civilization, and so on and so on. So what happened? What happened to all that? If you're Arab, not Jewish, if you're Arab, today, you grow up, you say, go to school. How do you explain the gap, the dissonance between what should be and what is? So as I say before, things happened, or a better explanation, a more satisfactory explanation, of course, is what? It's a Jewish plot. Because nobody could screw the situation over this way without it being a plot. You understand? Looking back in hindsight, nobody could do what we just did with the divide the Arabs up, chop them in different pieces, have them fight against each other, create dysfunctional dictatorships, and so on, unless somebody was planning it in the first place. You tell me, who could be so brilliant and genius to plan such a malevolent outcome that has lasted a century? Well, I know the answer to that. You see what I'm saying? This is how intelligent people think. And I want you to, PhDs, and get it through your head. And it's not really something to snicker at or laugh at, because people take it seriously and act upon it. That's my point. Now, I might also point out, as I have in the past, that in the 20th century there emerges a class in the early and middle 20th century. This is not there today. Of westernized intellectuals. These are Arabs. When I say to Arabs, what does that mean? So now it's like a college class. Define the word Arab. Is somebody who talks Arab? Is somebody ethnically Arab? What does that mean? Is it religious Arab? How do you define it? So these are people who 100 years ago defined Arab as national, not religious, which means that they were mostly Christians, if you follow. Most of the theoreticians of what you call the Arab nationalism, obviously, are not going to want to articulate an Arab identity, which is Muslim, because then they're on the outs. Obviously, it's going to be natural for them to articulate a definition of Arabness, which is secular and national, because then it doesn't matter what our religion is. And we can pretend it's the good old USA, in which regardless of race, color, and creed, in an area of the world in which the main factors of everything for thousands of years have been race, color, and creed. Okay? Have been race, color, and creed. So you're trying to impose a European definition, and it took Europe hundreds and hundreds of years to come up with this modern national business, right? It wasn't that long ago in Europe that the Protestants and the Catholics were rejecting each other, right? Not that long ago. It took a long time and a lot of developments. The Arab world never went through a Renaissance, a Protestant Reformation, an Age of Reason, an Enlightenment, a 19th century breakthrough in terms of technology. There's no Arab Darwin, Karl Marx. Do you get it? But these intellectuals, this is a phenomenon. When I'm talking about today's episode, it's gone, so you can analyze it. See, they lived in a time when they thought they could transpose successfully European ways of thinking about their own situation for the betterment of their own people, And so what was the result? They developed this concept called Arab nationalism that I just described. In the best sense of the word, they'll say it'd be one big Arab state in which the religion won't matter, the race, color, and creed won't matter, your Arabness, your identification with the Arab nationalism, which is the secular concept, will do. And theoretically, you could be Jewish. You can, by the way, you could be Jewish, you could be Christian, you could be Muslim, anything, even atheist. But you'd be Arab. You get it? That was the theory. Because the fact that these guys are weirdos that I just described, because everything I talked about, I think we know today with hindsight, was completely unrealistic. As I said before, this is a part of the world where thousands of years, the definition and reality has been race, color, and creed, like it or not. And because the nationalism that they are thinking over and coming up with in their minds is not taking place in the good old 1700s, like the USA, in time of Thomas Jefferson, where people could just be idealistic speculators. And I say that in the best sense of the term. But rather it's happening in the 20th century. It's not happening in a virgin continent like America, but it's happening in the Middle East, which is old hag. So it's not surprising, unfortunately, that the most dynamic aspects of Western modernity and second modernity are going to be the isms that are flourishing in the West in the 20th century. And so as a result, you end up with this Arab nationalism articulating a kind of a weird chant, as I called it over here. Okay? Go back one. They're going to combine, as they see it, the best elements. I mean, I'm serious about this. The best elements of Nazism, communism, and fascism. Okay? Because these were, you're looking over here, you're satisfied fat people living in Baltimore, bourgeois. Right? Now go back 100 years, or even 70 years, and what were the dynamic ideas that captured the imagination of a ton of intellectuals in Europe. And I'm afraid in this country, I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands who has a relative that was a communist. I'll get a lot of hands, right? So, it was such an ism era. Now, a Jew's not going to be in favor of Nazism, but, so these Arab nationalists articulate a vision in which you have a secular reality, but it won't simply be what you, in your fat, satisfied, bourgeois way of looking, says the perfect life, which is let me have my own house, and as long as my bathroom works and my car is paid up for, I'm fine, Then none of that. But you want proper organization of a society, a utopia to the degree that secularism can bring one. And different people saw it in Hitler and in Stalin, and even in Mussolini and places like that. And therefore, what you call the democracy and all that is a messy business which the real reality is a few rich people run the show. That's how they looked at it. And so, so the ideal Arab state these people articulated would be one that has all these kinds of, as I say, this cholent, composed of these funny elements, which are strange to us living in America, thank God. So what you have to understand is that, till this day, is Hitler an unpopular figure in the Muslim world and the Arab world? I think you know not. And it's not only because he killed the Jews, which they think is a good thing, of course, but it's also because, as is the case with many people around the world, Hitler, he organized his country right, he built the roads, he provided, to use the Mussolini term, the trains run on time, all that sort of thing. We're seen as a positive. If you're a left-winger, then you think, oh, Stalin, Stalin killed 50 million people. Gewaltig. You understand? No, he was a boss. When Stalin was in charge, he said, jump, you jumped. Some people like that. And these intellectuals that I'm talking about, for a large percentage, are there. Nasser and Sadat, I can tell you right now, are big fans of Hitler. I wouldn't necessarily say in public, but I think many of us know, because this is a crowd that knows something, that Sadat was supporting Hitler during World War II. He was one of those officers that tried to hook up with Rommel, when he was a young officer, to kick the British out. They don't see it as a bad thing. So I'm just trying to, if you want to know what's going on the other side, was the Tracht, what your neighbor across the street are thinking, it's a very different world. So now let's fast forward, because I'm not going to do a whole chazar from last year, to the late 1960s. And we have Nasser, the idol of Arab socialism, nationalism, has been exposed as having clay feet as a result of his defeat in the 6-Day War of 67. There was a time when wherever you went in bazaars and streets and stores throughout the Arab world, it was a picture of Nasser on the wall. How do I know this? Richard Nixon says it in his memoirs. He made his business, among other things, and we'll talk about it next week, to do a lot of foreign travel when he was out of office, a lot. And he went to all these countries in the Middle East, all of them. And he was a smart fellow. And he said, wherever you go, whatever the country is a picture. They don't have a picture of King Hussein somewhere, but they have a picture of Nasser. See, was the manifestation of a lot of hopes. And then he got busted in the 67 war, badly. And the loss of the Sinai Desert, particularly such a huge area, was exquisitely painful for the Egyptians and for the Arabs. And yet, Nasser's willingness to resign, to admit responsibility, impressed the Arab world, though he would never regain his earlier luster. So in the period we're talking about, by the time we get to the early 70s, Nasser dies in 70, he was a great person, all the rest of it, Nebuch, he wasn't what he might have been. Now, Nasser himself faced two options, as I said last year, after the 6-Day War. He could have cut a deal with Israel, get back to Sinai, and abandon the Palestinians. Just like this, I'll make a peace treaty with Israel, get a complete and total withdrawal, which Sadat later on got. And as far as the rest of the Arabs thing go, what happens to the Arabs in the West Bank and all those places, let them figure it out. I could animadvert on this, but I won't. I'll simply say that this is not what he chose to do, because Nasser had a very strong, beliefs and prejudice of his own. Instead, he was determined to champion the Palestinians. Right, there you go. Don't betray the cause. And that means that the only way you can do that is by defeating Israel militarily. So you have to do a reverse of the 6-Day War. This was the thinking of Nasser. Right or wrong? This was the thinking of Nasser. And that means you have to beat Israel. Do to them what they did to you. That's not so simple. The Egyptians were so frustrated, they couldn't get America in their corner. They had everybody else. How come that? How come Nixon, of all people, how come the USA is supporting Israel? Because as long as the U.S. is supporting Israel, giving them the weapons, even though it was never enough, and but still, since the USA is supporting Israel, this prevents the Arabs from mounting a successful campaign to reverse the 6-Day War. Because they were so angry at the USA, as we saw last year, they committed a major blunder, Nasser did. He allowed his heart to govern his mind. And he put all their eggs in one basket. Right? He went with Russia with both feet. Could Russia deliver? During 67 to 73, during those 6 years, 7 years actually, there were no diplomatic relations with the United States. May I remind you that in the wake of the Six-Day War, as part of his Arab desire to shift the blame somewhere else, he said, why was the Egyptian army beaten so badly in 67? It wasn't our fault, but Israel was aided by the Americans and the British. Do you recall that? And as a matter of fact, if you don't recall it, I will remind you that the Mossad taped and put out in public, you can hear it online, a phone call between Nasser and King Hussein saying, we got defeated, how are we going to say it to the public? And then he's like, let's say America did it. You know, Hussein, well, by the time it's over, to concoct the story. Okay? Now, I know you'll be shocked to hear that they lie, but nevertheless, this is what happened. In order to give it teeth, he's like this, we're breaking with America. And what he did, a whole bunch of countries did. Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, Mauritania, believe it or not that that matters so much, and Sudan, a whole bunch of countries broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. In the case of Nasser, this is very interesting. He kicked out the State Department, he kept the CIA. He says, if I ever really want to talk to America, I can do through the CIA, you get it? So there's no embassy and there's no consul and none of that kind of stuff. There was an apartment in which there lived a certain individual who worked for the CIA, you know, like that. Now, that means that Nasser committed a major strategic error. He threw himself totally into the arms of Russia, for which he got a lot of weapons and armaments. He got total support by Russia, and it did enable Nasser to build the fifth or sixth largest army in the world. Okay? In other words, weapons is one thing the Russians can give you. They can't give you apples, but they can give you weapons. So the Egyptian army was like 800,000. I mean, I don't know if you know what that is. That's gigantic. So I mean, American army, Russian army, Chinese army, and maybe I'm skipping 2 or 3. Maybe not. And then Egypt's up there. And my point is like this, that's totally unrealistic from an economic point of view. But Nasser said like this, I'll get the weapons from Russia, I'll get the money to do from the Arabians and all that. And from this way, we'll have like an Egyptian version of Zionist economics. Now the Russians did send a very big military mission to rebuild the Egyptian army from the bottom up. So in other words, Nasser said like this, we screwed up, the whole system is bad. It's not my fault. It's the fault of this guy who I put in charge of the military, which is true. And Abdul Hakam Amr, which we said last year, was Israel's best soldier. And the army was full of lousy generals and things like that, colonels. And it's a fact. And Nasser began a process after the Six-Day War of getting, first we got rid of him, he was killed. Or let's put it this way, they committed suicide on him. And then, little by little, they went down the line, and little by little went down the line, the Russians said like this, the captains stink, the colonels stink, this, that, and the other. It doesn't happen overnight. We got to get rid of the dead wood, as they say. And over a couple of years, they redid it from the bottom up. I'll tell you the main difference. Under Nasser, the college students were exempt from the draft. So that means you had officer corps that was a half literate and things like that. You need an officer corps that's a college educated or some level like that. I'll tell you even more than that. An army can't function properly unless they have a large supply of sufficiently educated non-commissioned officers. Just one of those little details that are interesting to military historians. Why did the Russians lose the First World War? Military historian will tell you like this. Russians had a complete undersupply of sergeants. The Germans had a very large supply of sergeants. The Russian army didn't function properly, and the German army functioned like a machine. There's truth to that. So I'm simply saying there's nuts and bolts. And under Nasser and then under Sadat, the Russians carry out, slowly but surely, a nuts and bolts situation in which this guy is replaced by this guy eventually. He's their worst general, he's their best. So under a Nasser situation, he's the main general. Under the new situation, he becomes the main general, General Shazali, who will command the Egyptian army in their victory in the Suez Canal in the Yom Kippur War, I'm sorry to say. Okay? So this means that real changes are happening in Egypt. Now, Israel was not gyrus this. We'll talk about this next in 2 weeks, I hope. Israel didn't pay much attention. As they say, same old junk, one general, another general, all the rest of it. It was a very unwise hubris on the part of Israel, and we paid the price for it. So what I'm explaining to you, or trying to, is Nasser got something from the Russian connection, no question about it. And this is very important what I'm describing. You get a new army with new officers from top to bottom, and full supply of weapons. Daiva Hoser, the Israelis will be shocked at the massive amount of weapons that the average Egyptian soldier has. Each guy has like 20 rockets to shoot at tanks and all the rest of it, which is not done in regular armies. So they did get stuff out of that. And from the Russian point of view, there was a complete defeat of the USA, because the Russians were penetrating Egypt and the rest of the Arab world with amazing success, totally outmaneuvering America. It was only recently, in the 50s, that under Ashton and Dulles, I might remind you, the U.S. had a whole system worked out to prevent the Russians from getting a foothold in any single Arab country. And there was a time when American diplomacy had the concept that just like we holding the line and keeping the Soviets out of Western Europe, called NATO, we can do the same thing in the Middle East, which worked for a while until it didn't. So in the time I'm talking about, by the time you get to 70, 72, 73, it's the opposite. Most of the countries have a Russian presence, and very few countries have American diplomatic relations. And the ones that do, don't flaunt it. Don't flaunt it. So in a Cold War sense, this was a plus for Russia. However, now comes something I find very interesting. In order to do this, in this process, the Soviets had to modify their religious theology, okay? Because Soviet Russia was a religion. It's not simply that they liked the ideas of Karl Marx. Marxism, religion, which I think all of us remember, they took very seriously. There was heresy, and there was burning at the stake, and everything that goes along with strong religion. There was orthodoxy and deviation from orthodoxy. Do you remember this? There used to be these party congresses in which the wrong guys were called out and so on and so forth. And this is very interesting because in the Soviet way of thinking, going back to Lenin, there's no such thing as friendship with another country. There's only strategic business until you convert that other country to a communist dictatorship. The best example that comes to mind is Fidel Castro, right? He teamed up with Russia, and then Castro became part of communism. There's no such thing that Russia has just a diplomatic friendship with another country that remains capitalist or non-communist, and by over there, socialism isn't good enough. It's a very strict orthodoxy. So you have to be Hasidish or you're not from. You understand? You have to follow the Soviet way, and just as is true of many religions, not the Jewish religion, many religions, you have to be from in my way. And if you follow the communism of China, oh boy, you're not from. Remember that? They used to have fights over this. Albania was always in Cherem in Moscow because they were for Chinese communism, the wrong kind. So now the Russians, if they're penetrating the Arab world, what does that mean to the Soviets? It means like this: we're engaged in a Stalinist type enterprise, which we may be flexible in the way we approach it, but the goal is clear. The goal is clear: is to convert the Middle East into a Soviet communist situation. So Egypt and Syria and Iraq and all these other countries, and eventually Saudi Arabia and Jordan, the guns of business, will become like Fidel Castro. They'll become just like Eastern Europe, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and all that business. They'll be communist countries and part of the communist world. That's the only way they thought. They don't know friendship. It's the friendship of the black widow spider. I don't know friendship. I only know the friendship in which I eat you. Right? That's who they are. As I say, think of Lenin and Stalin and all these, but they can't help it. That's what Russia was. And now they saw that they have amazing opportunities to penetrate the Islamic world. You see where I'm going? Are you going to communize them? And yet, if they want to have a foothold in these countries, they have to team up with guys like Nasser and Assad. And so they're not communists. They don't want to be communists. They're national leaders of their own. They're into themselves. You see? And so let's put it this way. If you want to be friendly with Nasser, Nasser is anti-communist. He's killing all the local Egyptian communists because he doesn't want the country taken over by this group. Many of the communists in Egypt, for example, were Jewish. To give you an example, that's right. So if you're Khrushchev, if you're Brezhnev, what do? Do you back your own frum followers? But of course that'll lead nowhere because they have no traction. Or do you go with the government and you sacrifice your guys on the higher altar of ultimate triumph? And obviously they go for the latter, don't they? So it's if you want to have fun, go read up on what happens to the poor communists in the Arab countries in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s until Russia falls apart. Because they never know what to do. We like you should be communist, you should support Russia, but don't alienate Assad. Don't get in the way of these guys. And eventually they even tell some of these communist parties to dissolve, and don't be there, but secretly try to undermine from the rest. So this was a theological problem. The result is that by the time you get to the time I'm talking about the 70s, you have alliances between the Russians and these Arab countries which are straight out of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Pure self-interest. There's no ideological component whatsoever. When you follow what happened with the Russians over there, you're back to this time. Let me get this straight. In the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s, it was Maria Theresa and George II versus Louis XV and Frederick the Great. But then came the 7 Years' War a few years later, from 1756, 1763, and it's Maria Theresa and Louis XV against Frederick the Great and George II. Right? What happened to the Grand Alliance? That was yesterday. See? And now it's called the diplomatic revolution. And now we look at things differently. You understand? What is the famous statement by Palmerston in Parliament in the 19th century? England has no permanent friends. England has no permanent enemies. England has permanent interests. Okay? So, and of course in America we know nothing about this. We never teamed up with Stalin, right? Exactly, right? There's realpolitik, as they call it. So that's a different business. That means that the Soviets can have a big base in Egypt, but overnight the Egyptians can kick them out tomorrow if they figure to serve their interests, which happened, right? They can make a favor this country today and then another country tomorrow. The Russians aren't used to that. You understand? They're used to, like I say, so the Blackwater sweater. We send in a team of experts, then we send in more experts. Do you remember, are you old enough to remember, those books like The Ugly American and things like this, in which the communists come in and they penetrate the nationalist movements in these mythical Southeast Asia countries and then eventually take them over, which really happened. Okay? Yeah, it's really happened. But what do you do when you're out of the Middle East? It ain't happening. You see? So what did Russia gain? If you ask the question. Looking back now with our perspective today. They got some naval ports. They got some UN votes. Not much, in other words. They poured in billions. And Russia's not a rich country. They poured in billions on this Arab business. Okay? Algeria, Egypt, Syria. They're still in Syria, aren't they? They're backing up Assad because Assad gives them a naval port in Latakia. Right? And Iraq and a bunch of other places. And so the Cold War game was played, that way. We back the Saudis, you back the Yemenites. We back the Jordanians, you back the Syrians, and all that stuff. That was the Nixon era. But what the Russians actually gain out of this? What the Americans gain out of this? But the problem is, of course, that Russia is a very religious country in the ideological Marxist sense. And so it's hard for an ideological power to swallow what I just told you, but they did. They were so into the Cold War game that they're willing to do everything I just said. But as religious Marxists, of course, like a Chabad house in a tough situation, they hoped and expected that the Arab world would, in the fullness of time and under the proper gentle prodding, convert to the true faith. It's not going to happen today. It won't happen tomorrow. I'm sure these communists send back letters to Moscow. It's a long journey, but eventually they'll become Shomer Shabbos. You'll see. Eventually. Okay? In the Soviet analysis, starting in the 50s, the key to the eventual conversion of the Arab world was, of course, Egypt, the largest and most modern country. Okay? I'll say it again. Egypt was the largest Arab country, still is. And at that time, under Nasser, certainly was the most modern country, if you define modernity along the lines of socialism and all the rest of it. And so they said like this: if we can get Egypt, and this is the statement I'm about to make is not incorrect, it just wasn't true. If we can get Egypt to convert somehow or other, become a communist country like a Fidel Castro situation, then a powerful Arab communist Egypt will definitely spread to the rest of the Arab world, won't it? Then we'll have what we want. And in their analysis, Nasser was becoming from little by little, even though he didn't know it. This is what they call false consciousness, by Leninist terms. You see? Nasser was heading towards Marxism in the Soviet analysis, even though Nasser didn't realize it. After all, under Nasser, the country is westernizing to a certain degree. They're introducing Nasser is famous, among other things, for free college, so which was a big deal. So, I mean, that really was a big deal. Under Nasser, they started free high school and free college. We don't have that in this country. And college and high school means secular. And so you have millions of people now have a secular education. You don't have that in Saudi Arabia. You see what I'm saying? And the Russians hoped that although he doesn't realize it, it's moving people to a mindset in which they can appreciate Karl Marxism. It's very interesting based on the lectures I gave this past summer at the Haskalah. Nothing has changed with the Russians. They're back to, let's go to the next one. They're back to Nicholas I and Count Uvarov saying if we can encourage the Haskalah, that'll undermine the Frum. Same thing. There you go. Go back one. No. Here. Whoa. Next one. Stop. Okay? Here's, what do you call it? This guy, this is Count Uvarov in the time of Nicholas I. And he was the one who said like this: encourage the Maskilim, they'll undermine the yeshivas, and little by little the Russian Jews will all convert to Christianity, which wasn't necessarily false. Here you have Khrushchev, and this is his counterpart. This is Suslov, Mikhail Suslov, who was the ideological, he's the chief rabbi of the Communist Party, let's put it that way. And he's always saying like this: oh, we have to encourage all the progressivist elements in Egypt and these other countries. And remember, they view the world through a Marxist, or more accurately, a Leninist glasses, and they produce funny results to us because we're not Leninists, most of us. But it's the reality the way they see it. You understand? Just like a Frum person views reality through their lenses, so Frum communists once upon a time viewed reality through their lenses, and they do believe that the Nasserite Haskalah will weaken Islamic ultra-orthodoxy and pave the way for the eventual mass conversion to the Russian true faith, which of course by the 20th century is no longer Russian Orthodoxy, but it's Marxism. Because you'll see, now, for those who don't understand exactly what I'm saying, I will remind you that Marxism is a concept system. It's not simply a method of economic analysis, which of course it is. Right? Marx is analyzing the relationship of economics to reality and saying it's the most important thing. But Marx and the guys who follow them are very strong in their shittas, and they're very militantly atheist. You can't be a religious Marxist. Now, there were a few, after all, they had some Bnei Akiva Kibbutzim, tried to combine a certain Marxism, but there is here and there. But 99%, 98%, a Marxist has to buy the whole package. One could challenge that and say, what does one have to do with the other? But it doesn't matter. It'd be wrong, because the way Marxism developed as a historical phenomenon is it's a package deal. And therefore our relatives, uncle this, cousin that, grandfather that, who became Marxists, became, in terms of their hashkava, militant atheists. That's what it was. You understand? It's a package deal. So once you know that, how's that going to work in the Muslim world? The Soviets, in their way, whenever they sent delegates and diplomats and stuff like that to Egypt, they did like the, the Brigham Young, one thing, the Mormons, you friend people, get it? Said, oh, Shita, let's say, for example, this guy's a Soviet journalist. He's sent to Egypt for 2 years. Make sure you become friendly with this person and that person who's going to college or is a college graduate, not with a cleric, and little by little you be mashpia on them, okay? And so therefore they friend Egyptian college students, army officers, those with higher education. People are potentially the communists of tomorrow. There are many conferences in the late 60s and early 70s of, like we say, a Kirov, you know? Say the Soviets would bring all kind of intellectuals, and they'd have public conferences, exchange of ideas with Egyptian intellectuals, and these were written up in the paper and given a great play. There are books on this. But the big stumbling block, of course, was religion, which the Russians didn't want to acknowledge. Only a tiny handful of Egyptians became mamish atheists, which I told you is basic to Marxism. The great majority remained believers, including Nasser himself. Right? Nasser, till the day he died, was like Teaneck, you know. There was a modern Orthodox. He was Orthodox, but he was modern Orthodox. But I'll say it again. He's a believer. You know, he went to Mecca, the whole business. He bowed down 5 times a day, Nasser I'm talking about. The Russians were deluding themselves, we see in retrospect. Cairo, among other things, is the headquarters of the Al-Azhar Mosque and the Al-Azhar Yeshiva. This is the #1 religious center for the Sunnis. It's like the Gaonic yeshivas. I'm not sure who copied who. I think the Gaonim, seriously, I think the Gaonim copied from here. That they're the biggest buckies in Shas and Poskim of Islam. And they enjoy this kind of reputation in the Sunni world. That if you want to know the halacha of the Islamic business, these are the ones, you know, like that. So Egypt is, among other things, the headquarters of a very religious tradition over here, okay? And these mosques, and there's dozens of them, I mean, are part and parcel of what Egypt is. So whatever the Egyptian development is going to be in the 21st century, it's not going to exclude this business, okay? Let's get that straight. But the Soviets were deluding themselves. They had to delude themselves, otherwise they would have to admit the impossibility of the communization of the Islamic countries. What happened in Russia? They killed, Lenin and Stalin killed all these type of guys. They destroyed these churches. They blew them up. I mean, they physically destroyed them. I myself, last month, in August, was in Russia for a couple of days. I wrote in the Weird One. And one of the things you see over there, what strikes me is all the churches are back. Obviously, the governments have put out the money, and wherever you go, you see an old decrepit synagogue. Then across the street or something like that, you see a brand new, spanking clean church with these kind of golden things at the top. So wherever you go throughout the Ukraine and Lithuania and such places, is a church after church, because they want to bring back what the Russians did. So back in the 1920s and all that, the unbelievably ruthless regimes of Lenin and Stalin, you could literally, as Lenin put it, tear religion out by the roots. You can't do this in Egypt. And tell me how you're going to do it in Saudi Arabia and the other countries. I mean, how are you going to do that? So the Russians were mamish deluding themselves. But a religious person believes, Mirz Hashem, one day things will happen, and that's they saw it. On the other hand, Nasser's Egypt, like most World War II countries, most countries that came being after World War II, did go for socialism in a big way. They were enchanted by the vision of the social welfare state. Who wouldn't? Now that's not a matter of religion now, correct? That's socialism in the purely social welfare sense. What we call in America Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, Obamacare, free education, that kind of business, housing, right? Public ownership of the means of production, if you want to get down to it. Israel did this, didn't they? Just about every country, with very few exceptions, just about every, Japan did not do it because of MacArthur, but just about every country that came into being after World War II went for socialism in a big way. It's an enchanting vision, and that's why all the economy is screwed up. But nevertheless, what's the alternative? To have the old capitalism and people just starve in the streets the way it used to be? You see, these are existential questions that we're dealing with over here. So Nasser and the Algerians and the Libyans and the Syrians and the Iraqis and so forth all committed themselves with the countries or the regimes that they set up after the Second World War eventually to have socialism, that the government owns all the factories and the government provides employment for everybody and housing and roads and schools and all the business. Socialism also in Egypt and these other countries had the great allure of no foreign control over any of the companies. The first thing these places pass is a law that's still in place today in many places, which is Egypt has to own 51% of anything. Okay? And that's because they got messed over by the millionaires from America and England and France, the way they see it. The oil companies, I'll give you an example. Right? And foreign capital means foreign control. And next thing you know, the mafia is in charge, and who knows? This way, no foreign thing owns any shtick of Egypt or of Algeria or Tunisia or any other country. You can hear that. However, as we all know, my friends, it's one of the great conundrums of modern economics. If you don't have foreign investment, ain't gonna help. Let's put it this way. Is it true in the United States that only Americans own all the stuff? Right? Who provides a heck of a lot of employment in this country for American workers? Is it Japan? Is European? Right? I mean, that's the modern world. Okay? But that's not how he saw it. And you can understand it because they had this, what they regarded as this colonialist experience. Now, of course, in all these countries, socialism led to bad economies because you get no foreign investment. Let's put it this way. I'm going to put in $1 million as investment and Egypt control 51%. Bye-bye. But socialism did provide intense emotional satisfaction. That's why Israel did it. That's the other one did it. And I think you can totally understand when Nasser said everybody's going to get some kind of health care, even if it's not great health care, it's 1,000,000 times better than it's been before then when there was zero health care. If Nasser said that anyone who can pass the test can get a free high school and free college, what did that mean for a peasant family? You can't deny it. In this country, we used to call it the GI Bill. Remember that after the war? And things like that, in which the education is the key to the future. These are very massive. The only problem, of course, is what? Who pays? Right? That's the problem. But if you can ignore that problem, which Israel ignored, and Egypt ignored, and hundreds of countries around the world ignored until the bubble burst. If you can ignore it, then everything's great. It's very, very satisfying. Knowing what we know today, therefore, there were no chances of any Soviet success in any of these countries in the way that the Russians defined success, at turning into a Fidel Castro. The Arabs resented such attempts at Kirov, and the Arabs made darn sure to manage their relationship with the USSR on a strictly realpolitik basis. This, in effect, doomed any chance for communism in the Middle East, and that's why communism never happened. And when the Russians tried to go in head first, feet first, in Afghanistan, we know what happened, blew up in their face. Okay? It also meant that the instant any Arab regime felt it could do better with the West, it wouldn't hesitate to dump the Russians. Because I don't love you, this is just a matter of self-interest. And of course, Sadat became the poster boy for this eventually, after the Yom Kippur Wars we all know, or you will soon. On the other hand, Soviet support, Russia's a bad dictatorship. Soviet support was tailor-made to help the Arab states perfect the infrastructure of dictatorship. Russians can give you weapons, and the Russians can give you a lot of KGB advice, correct? They can tell you how to set up your torture rooms, your concentration camps, your snitch system, your, what's the right word, listening in on people, following all the, the telephone conversations. I mean, they're the tops. Everywhere in the late 60s and 70s, throughout the Arab world, throughout the Muslim world, dictatorships rose, flourished, and the Arab population languished helplessly. So, if you're in Syria, it's this. If you're in Yemen, it's that. If you're in Libya, it's this. If you're in Iraq, it's that, et cetera, et cetera. It's a musical chairs. One dictator leaves, next one comes aboard. So who gets really hurt? The public. Right? Who gets hurt? The public. This is actually a very interesting phenomenon because what is a dictatorship? It's saying like this: let me have all the power, but what do I give in return? No, I'm serious. What do I give in return? I mean, if you have a dictatorship where there's no law and order even, then it's just a complete failure, right? Like you have in Africa, these countries, there's a dictatorship, but on the other hand, you can't walk on the street. So what's the point? So at the very minimum, a dictatorship has to say, I guess, we're giving you law and order. You can walk on the street. And they did. If you're talking about the 60s and 70s, they could deliver on that. It wasn't a civil war. It wasn't a dysfunctional situation. The train works, so to speak. School works, so to speak. could be a lousy level, a better level. The hospital, better level, not better level, works. You can live a life. That's the minimum. In the long run, that's not enough. In the long run, for a dictatorship to work, in addition for the law and order, what else do you need? You got to be able to provide economic. So if I can give you, let me put it this way. I'm not going to really ask you this, but how many people vote in this country? Vote, V-O-T-E, okay? A lot don't, is my point, right? A lot don't. Like I say, I'm not going to ask. But I do. I even vote for dog catcher. I take those things seriously. But a lot of people I know don't. A lot of people say, I don't want to go to the jury. You know, all the 100 reasons. 100 reasons. I think it's wrong. Doesn't matter. They don't have to. Okay? And my point is like this. You can live in America and have zero contact with politics if that's what you choose to do. Right? That's what you could use. So there are people out there that don't care whether it's Trump or Hillary. There are. There are people out there that didn't care whether it was Obama or, I don't know, whoever the other guy was, right? You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter to them. Okay. So what does that mean? Your life is one of private interiority. I got my family, I got my friends, I got my job. It's hard enough to make a living. When I have a chance, I go on vacation. Like I said before, my mortgage is okay. I got my car. I came back from a mechanic. The bathroom works. I'm okay. You understand? I have food on the table. So if the dictatorship can provide, basic standard of living, as we say over there, then it's sort of justified itself. What about the Thomas Jefferson ideas of representative government, all the rest of it? No. All right? That's how it goes for much of the world, and that's how it always has gone, and I fear it probably will. Okay, we're lucky, but the rest of the world isn't necessarily like that, as you know. And in those places where they have the kind of dictatorship that I just described, which is as long as they don't interfere in the political process, as long as they don't ask no questions, I got my job, I got my pension, my car works, and so on and so forth, my kids are going to go to school and get their jobs, shine. The Arab countries in the 60s and 70s, the dictatorships can deliver on the law and order, they can't necessarily deliver on the economics. This is a slow process. You understand? It was starting to unravel because you could still take foreign loans and sort of hide the fact that, like I say, who's paying for the free college and who's paying for the free this and that. But eventually, as you and I know, came home to roost. What about the fact that after the Yom Kippur War, they come to oil? The oil should pay for everything. Kleptocracy. The guys at the top steal all the money. That's what happened. See, that's what happens. So first thing, if you remember, Kennedy started the Peace Corps. First thing they had to learn in the Peace Corps is you send all the aides, just get used to it. If you're in this third world country, this guy and that guy are going to steal everything. So, don't come and say where the pencils, because somebody stole them. Just use your own pencils. The first thing you learn when you're in the Peace Corps. So all the Russians could do was help with the dictatorship part. A country like Iraq likes that. They don't have to take Western opinion into account as it acted brutally. After all, it doesn't even have diplomatic relations with the USA. And the Russians are not going to complain, so what does Saddam Hussein care if it's 1970, if he's shooting somebody? Nixon's not saying anything, they don't even have an embassy. So what's the result in the Arab world of police states? All police states, which offer their people lies and lies, socialism without the ability to pay for social programs, law and order, but is that enough to justify tyranny? This is not my question. Machiavelli writes about this 500 years ago, doesn't he? He talks to the prince. What's to Machiavelli, who's in the 15th century, if the guy can deliver on the law and order, remember he said better to be feared than admired? And in the Italy of his time, Caesar Borgia, if he imposed a strong regime, it could be law and order, he can walk on the roads, then it's okay. Forget about the democratic government. The socialism inevitably degenerated, as I said, into kleptocracy by the tribe of the dictator, so that the socialism ruined the economy. Take Syria. I always like Syrian example, because if you look at the numbers, Syria under Assad has negative economic growth, right? A negative economic growth, which was all good for Israel. We didn't know it at the time. We thought, Hafiz al-Assad is terrible. Actually, the best thing for Israel. who's messing over the economy, because anything that actually worked, he stole, you know? So it's gewaldic from the Israeli point of view, which is why we had this discussion the other day. If you ask any Syrian or Arab today, there's not even I'm serious about this. It's going to sound bizarre, but I'm very serious. You ask any intelligent Arab today, there's no question that for 30 years he was a Mossad agent. You know why? Nobody could screw over the situation in Syria so successfully unless it's part of a plot. Get it? And he did it with such exquisite, because you take a large country like Syria, which has an educated class, a large merchant class, and you mess things over unbelievably, till eventually, as we know, it descended into a civil war of a savage state, you know, they're gassing each other or whatever. Who could create a situation? Well, we do what everybody always says, cui bono. Who's the beneficiary? Israel. Well, then what's the question? So you see, Assad, of course, and by the way, he's not a Muslim. He's an Alawite, you know, that's really an Israeli plot, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is how they think over there, you understand? This is how they think. What can I tell you? All this was depressing for the theoreticians and the ideologues of Arab nationalism. This is the fruits of the restoration of Arab self-rule? Does it not reveal the Arabs as maladroited government? Does it indicate that the Arabs are not what they always claim to be? A supremely gifted race, particularly gifted at governance? Didn't we Arabs once create an empire from the Atlantic Ocean to India, which was brilliantly governed and so on and so forth? You know, the golden age of the Arabs, they developed science and mathematics and all the rest of it. Doesn't that show that we're, as I say before, not just another group, but a gifted race? How do you explain, if you're an Arab, the dissonance between the glorious past and the inglorious present? Right? How do you, look what happened, okay? How did Arab nationalist intellectuals explain their current non-greatness? The question I'm asking, of course, is were they capable of self-criticism, which is a very high madrega. In Jewish religion, we believe self-criticism. Didn't we not finish the month of Elul? There was no self-criticism. Everything that's happened bad is the fault of colonialism. Of the damn Europeans, colonialists, who actually were only there for 20 years, 30 years. How long were the British and the French in the Middle East? From World War I, the end, 1919, to what? Late 40s, 50s? You know that. No, it's not a long time. Now today is 2017. It's 100 years. So everything is the fault because they were there for 30 years? You see my point? Does that work? You've been free, so to speak, for 60 years? 70 years now? Unless you say like this, well, you think we've been free, but the Mossad, the British put in this dictator and that. You know, if you blame them. So first of all, it's the fault of colonialism. It's not our fault. By 1972, the Arabs have been independent for 2 decades and still made a mess of things. Facts do not matter to the anti-colonialist rhetoricians of the 1970s world culture. As the Egyptian leader, Boutros Ghali, famous, remember that guy? Who became the head of the United Nations program? He says the third world doesn't have military or economic power, but the third world has ideology. That's what he said. So this third world phenomenon, third world, is one of the unexpected consequences of the intersection, the weird intersection of, number one, the creation of the United Nations, number two, the Cold War. This was not part of the plan. When Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had in mind, when they set up the United Nations, was like this. There'd be 3 or perhaps 4 big countries, and they'll rule the world, and they'll tell everybody else, get your act together, or, you know, we'll hurt you, or something like that. That was really, that's what FDR saw it. You know, Stalin will have his chalik, America will run Latin America, and I don't know what else, the British will run their part, China, he saw it. It was delusional. China, Chiang Kai-shek will run his part, and these will be the policemen, and that'll be best for the world, and there'll be no more wars. Aren't some of us old enough to remember when the United Nations was a good thing? Right? Did you ever collect money for the UNICEF and all that business? Would you admit that to your grandchildren? Did you ever take a high school trip to the United Nations building? Would you imagine a TA of Beis Yaakov wanting to go to visit the United Nations on their trip to New York and their senior trip today? You see? It's not. Instead, what happened was all these countries came together because they have numbers. Therefore, they make all these votes in the United Nations. They create this upside-down situation, which Israel is a big victim of. So you have what is normal in the United Nations, which is who's the head of the Human Rights Committee? You know, Assad or somebody like that, right? Remember Libya a couple years ago? I mean, we're used to this. correct? These are the people in charge of the human rights. So what's going on over here? By the 1970s, the United Nations had turned into a major problem for the United States of America, which is ridiculous because the United Nations is nothing, is garnished. All these countries in Africa and Asia have no power whatsoever. It's just they're voting, which is why Moynihan wrote his famous book. What does he call it? Dangerous Place. Because he said we've created a monster, you see? Now let's look at the Arab-Israeli conflict through the lens of the Arab nationalist ideology, which is already ripe, or actually overripe by the 1970s. The Arabs claim to be innocent victims of colonialism, thereby identifying with other third world countries like Nasser is doing over here with the Africans, which are all members of the third world, and Israel has just heard us, they've heard all the third world. But the Arab cultural tradition is a lie. The Arab cultural tradition is one of a hegemonic master race born to rule others. Look what a great job we did back then. This world that they call the Golden World is a world of oppression and domination by one group, the Arabs, over the others. Okay? Look at the next map. This overlooks the Arab violent domination of non-Arabs and non-Muslims. The caliphate, as they call it, was an empire, it wasn't a commonwealth. So who got the short end of the stick? The Kurds, the Armenians, the Indians, the Druze, the Christians, the Jews, the Egyptians, Spaniards, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just give you one example. Back in the old days, in the Arab Empire, 1,000 and 1,500 years ago, one of the countries they conquered was Persia. There was a lot of wars to conquer the Persians. The Persians regard themselves as a master race, because back in Ahasuerus and all that, they had a gigantic empire of their own. It sticks in their throat today that they were once messed over by the Arabs. They hate the Arabs ad yom hazeh. And they're constantly plotting to reassert the Iranian domination of the Arab world, to take over eventually Arabia and all that. This is what the Iranians are into now. You can't stop it, such as a natural business. What of the fact that you were once conquered by them? It's very unfortunate. And in a fascinating way, how has this rejection of Arabism expressed itself in Iran? First of all, they dumped the Arab language. They're the only big Muslim country to do that. And number two, they switched the religion to the Shia. So that gives them a distinct, separate identity. So the Arabs are all the Sunni junk, you know what I mean? The real religion is over here. Now it was, believe it or not, Iran was once a Sunni country, but back in the late 1400s, early 1500s, the guys switched the whole thing over. Ever since then, it's been basically part of the Iranian identity. So the Arabs are saying like this, oh, we're part of the third world that were beat up by Israel and the colonials. You did it when you had a chance. You do it in a second. The Jews in particular, in this view, have no claim to a land of their own. It's Arab land. What about the Jewish claims that they do want their own land? Number one, tough. Number two, how dare you? Number three, you have zero claim on the land. And number four, it's a European colonialist plot, and that by itself makes it illegitimate. So the Jews have no rights whatsoever. Right? I want you to understand this. They're complaining they're ones being beat up by the other, but you don't grant anybody in the Middle East the right to have their own. I might call attention to the fact that this very week, as you know, the Kurds try to make up their own business, and all the Arabs are ganging up on them. You have no right. Theodor Herzl and company, according to these Arabs, are nothing but colonialist agents. How could there be anything else? It can't be really Jewish that want to have their own country. The Jews don't want to have their own country because the Jews are nothing. Jews, after all, don't really have claims. Such claims are not really worthy of consideration. So how could a guy like Herzl do this? Unless he was a secret agent working in the pay of the European colonial powers to mess over the Arabs. Now, let's be honest. Herzl and company did in fact adopt a policy of securing European as opposed to Middle Eastern support. That's what Herzl did. Because he said like this, we're not going to wait for the Arabs. It'll never happen. Now you can say this was a wise idea. You can say it was an unwise idea. And already long ago, in Herzl's times, he was criticized by many people in the Zionist movement for doing what I just said. What are you putting your eggs in the basket of the European colonials? That's going to stigmatize Zionism as a colonialist plot, and the Arabs will hate you forever. This was the argument of Achad. Okay? And Herzl was aware of this problem, but he wasn't going to let Jewish claims be held back by Middle Eastern resistance. Because according to you Arabs, I'll never get a state ever. So it's tricky, isn't it? It's tricky. This enabled the Arabs to stigmatize Zionism as a European colonialist plot, which it wasn't. We're Jewish, we know. You can't say that the Zionist movement was a European colonialist plot to establish something in the Middle East. If anything, the Zionists tried to take advantage of the Europeans. When the Balfour Declaration happened, as we talked about not long ago, this merely confirmed this analysis in the Arab eyes. After all, England, right, which is a colonialist country, gave Palestine to the Jews, in the middle of the Arab world and all the rest of it. This is happening as we know right now because it's the year 2017 and it happened in 1917. So the fact that Israel came into being via the Balfour Declaration is confirmation for the Arabs that the whole Zionism is nothing but a British plot, which it isn't. But you have to be willing to sit through 10 lectures of what actually happened with the Balfour, right? Not in Baltimore. He said to know what actually happened. It wasn't that. If anything, it's the other way around. But you see, an Arab will never understand why would a guy like Balfour, because it is hard to understand, why would a guy like Balfour, who was a British statesman, actually feel any reason to go give the Jews a whole piece of, it is an interesting story, right? So I say, it's a sublime story. They say, no, it's not a sublime story, it's a devilish story, you see? It goes to show you the nature of the whole Arab-Israeli conflict. This afforded the Arabs ideological justification of rejecting any Jewish national presence whatsoever, binational or otherwise. The whole thing's a colonialist plot, it has to be eradicated. The competing Jewish nationalism, if you want to call it that, which started at the same time as the Arab nationalism, problematized the Arab nationalism, messed over the Arab nationalism. That's their secular religion. The success of the Jews, because this is the real problem, in setting up the Yishuv and then a state and then defeating the numerically superior and morally superior Arabs, constituted a kasha on the narrative of Arab nationalism, which of course postulates a unilateral progressive development. Like I said before, in the Arab way, it should be that the Arabs kicked out the others, took over, and they all live happily ever after. So how does Israel fit in all this? By the 1970s, all the Middle Eastern territories should have been held by the Arabs, all adhering to the political doctrine of Arab nationalism in one form or another. That's the way the world should have been, and if it wasn't, how do you explain that? Prior to the Six-Day War, the nationalists argued that Israel was a very temporary phenomenon. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember before the 67 war. They always just say, yeah, Israel won't even be there by 1970. The 48 war, let's face it, had occurred when the Arabs were not organized. The Palestinians have been in disarray. Once the Arabs get their act together, once the British and French colonies are really kicked out of the Middle East, the Arabs can run the Middle East by themselves. Don't we remember, let's go to the... Yeah, you could turn off the sound. Yeah, I don't need it. He says, remember the crowds before the Six-Day War, kill Israel? I think we all remember that. Many of us remember that. What happened over there? The cheering crowds were saying, it's 19 years, Ganuk shine, now we're going to wipe them out. Israel had no business being there in the first place, and they're on a very temporary basis. And they only were there in 48 because the Arabs were not ready, but now we're ready, and now we're going to do the job right. And then, of course, the 67 war was a system shock, because the reverse of what it should have been. And it was this shock which dominated the Arab world in the years that we're talking about in the early 70s. There wasn't the slightest interest in peace with Israel, but the opposite. But the problem is, what do you do? Israel's too strong. So Nasser said like this, belief, ani mamin b'emunah shlema, that with Soviet help, we can get stronger than Israel. Like I said, if you build the army up from the top up, from the bottom up, you can do it. The Soviets themselves were skeptical. The Soviets themselves say you can't beat Moshe Dayan. Okay? The Soviets are playing a good, cute game. They say, we'll give you more weapons, and we'll make you have more than Israel, a ton more, all the rest of it. But don't go to war with Israel. This was a mistake in 67. Not till you're ready. When are you going to be ready? Mañana. Okay? I'll tell you right now, when the 73 war breaks out, Brezhnev said, what, these idiots? And they're expecting that Egypt will get busted right away, and they're like shocked when Egypt is successful. The Soviets said, this is part of our game. We'll give them everything, we'll help them, but don't take on Israel. Nasser wants to reconquer all of Sinai and Gaza, which means to invade Israel itself. That's a tall order. That's who Nasser was. He wasn't flexible in his policy. That's his nature. He wants, or psychologically needs, to refight the 48 war, because Nasser was in the 48 war. He's one of the Egyptians that were defeated. He was a major in the army. I couldn't find, they took offline. Rav Goren had this show in Israel, what's it called? Chaim Shekelu, which is This Is Your Life. They have such a show in Israel in the 70s. And he said that, after the 48 war, the part of the armistice was that the Jews can pick up all the dead bodies of Jewish soldiers and take them back to Israel. So Goren was the army rabbi, so he went to do it. Nasser was a major. He drove him around to all the cemeteries. You understand? So to him, 48 is a psychological stain, and he wants to fix it. But by 1970, Nasser drops dead, and is succeeded by Anwar Sadat. This harbingers significant change in three areas. Okay, there's a big difference between Nasser and Sadat. Number one, a slow move away from the intense socialism in the economy. That's just who Sadat was. He said, we're broke. There were bread riots and all this kind of stuff. Nasser had bread riots, and how long can you handle this? So we got to figure some way to introduce a certain amount of private economy. It didn't work. Ad hayom hazeh, it's a kleptocracy, like I said before. That's how it works over there. I don't know how it's going to change, but they called intifa. They open up the infitah. They open up the economy to a little bit of capitalism, which already means that you're not following in the right direction of Kirov towards Sovietism. Number two, and this is very controversial, Sadat stopped Nasser's long war and persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood. One of the features of Nasser, which we didn't know when growing up, was he was keeping all these bad guys down. The Nasser regime, because the Muslim Brotherhood tried to assassinate him in 1954, so he killed them. And all during the 50s and 60s when he was in power, the regime was hanging and shooting and concentration camping all these fanatics. Said Qutb, I think his name is, the theoretician of the Muslim Brotherhood, was hanged by Nasser in 1966, for example. You understand? That's what it was. And the Soviets, this is all part of their thing. That shows you he's moving in the right direction. Sadat, in order to fight the Soviets, says, I'm going to ease up on them. There will be more religion out there, and that'll hurt all the people who are to the left of me. So, to be exact, here are the three big machers. Nasser, Sadat, Ali Sabri. These are three big officials. So he's dead. He's the next guy, but the Russians want him. Well, the way you knock him out is you make the country more religious. For anybody who is a pro-communist in any way, or Marxism in any way, becomes treif. And it worked. But of course, it worked too well, didn't it? The Muslim Brotherhood shot Sadat 10 years later. This is the problem. There's no such thing as gratitude over there. Now, I'm serious. And finally, and most controversially, and with this I'm moving to my end, Sadat, unlike Nasser, was willing to demonstrate flexibility towards the conflict in Israel. We didn't know it at the time. Mentally, Sadat accepts that he cannot mamish conquer Israel, which is something that mentally Nasser cannot bring himself to do. In the long run, of course, he would like to see Israel destroyed, which Egyptian won, till today. But Sadat is willing to be much more flexible, adroit, and dancing around in the diplomatic arena. Let's get something out of Israel now, and with the future will take care of itself. His thinking evolves something along the following lines. If it's possible to pressure or persuade Israel out of the Sinai, Egypt is willing to sign a cold peace. Cold peace means we won't have embassies and good relations, but we won't go to war with Israel. And we'll let their ships go through the Suez Canal. At that time, there's epis, right? It's called non-belligerency. Should you work it? Now, Golda Meir said, I guess, no, we want a full peace or nothing. But I'm just saying, this is the first time that an Arab leader is talking these kind of terms. And I might point out that Egypt, even though they signed a treaty in 79, has a cold peace. I mean, they do have an embassy, but that's it. Okay? If a conflict becomes inevitable, Sadat says, Egypt should fight not to conquer Israel because that's too far, but to spark plug a set of political events which will result in Israel's yielding back to Sinai. That's what he got. See, so we don't have to conquer the whole Sinai, just a chelet. And that'll start the whole process rolling, and he was right about that. And eventually we get the whole business back. Now, he ended up having to pay a bigger price than he thought he would have to pay, but eventually he's willing to pay back the price. And he figures if he recovers the lost Sinai, then Sadat gains instant, total, and eternal legitimacy and authority in Egypt. He outshines Nasser. And I want to emphasize, this is very interesting today. If you ever follow in the memory of these other Arab sites, TV, they hate Sadat, but they don't. As they always say like this, he signed a treaty with the hated enemy and this, that, and the other, but he got back to signing every inch. So they always have to throw that in because you can't totally hate him because he got value for money. He got all the land back. So if he wins back the Sinai, which he did, then he instantly gains what all the other others don't have, which is legitimacy. So that's his goal. But Sadat is sufficiently astute to realize, this is where it gets funny, that Russia cannot deliver Israel. The Russians made that big mistake by breaking off relations with Israel also. So then they're not parties. Only Nixon can deliver Israel. Precisely because he's the one who's friends with Israel. On the other hand, Egypt, thanks to Nasser's blunder, Sadat realizes, has no diplomatic relations with the USA whatsoever. Moreover, Egypt is full of Soviet advisors and weapons by the thousands. They have Soviet naval bases and listening posts. In other words, Egypt is part of the enemy camp in the Cold War. That is certainly and understandably how it appears to the USA. So why should Richard Nixon even want to help? So I need Nixon, but on the other hand, we've alienated him. On the other hand, Sadat absolutely needs the Russians for weapons, and the Russians are very jealous girlfriends. You can't look and make any eyes at anybody else. So Sadat cannot publicly praise or back America. So how do you keep this girl, but start, how do you do it? Now people have done that, not in Baltimore, but elsewhere. But it's not so simple. Internally, Egypt is full of Nasserite officials and intellectuals who have been continually fed the anti-American rhetoric of Nasser's propaganda machine all during the 50s and 60s. Remember, this is the height of the Vietnam War. This is the height of fashionable anti-Americanism in the Third World. So what's Sadat supposed to do? How do you get America on your side in order to mess over Israel without alienating your arms source and your political support source? How do you get to this guy Nixon when you don't even have an ambassador in Washington? So you might say through the State Department. After all, they're WASPs, and the Egyptian diplomats are very good with that. They're very brilliant. But it's notorious by 1971 that Nixon ignores the State Department. I remember even I knew that. Okay? It's weird. Richard Nixon, who doesn't have a reputation as pro-Jewish, has this Jewish guy who is the gatekeeper. The Egyptians couldn't understand it. If you remember the Nixon administration, from day one, he set up the national security system in such a way that everything goes through Kissinger. Right? I mean, I think we recall this. Those are my age. I mean, he literally was the gatekeeper. Mordechai Yosef B'Shar Melech. You can't get to see the Melech without going through Mordechai. Okay? So, if you're Egyptian, now I told you before, you're looking through the world through Lenin eyes, now looking through the world through Sadat eyes. What's gate on? You know what I mean? Lyndon Johnson knew, but Nixon, I don't hop. Okay? What's going on over here? Nixon, isn't he an anti-Semite? Why does he have such arrangements? Why is he backing Israel? Right? It doesn't make any sense. Moreover, just as this process is starting to develop in 71, Richard Nixon, whose administration had been in the doldrums for 2.5 years, remember Kent State? Remember the Cambodia and 100 other mishaps? Richard Nixon, who couldn't do anything right, suddenly skyrocketed to world fame. Did he not? And launched a 2-year period of unbelievable foreign policy success. He turned the whole thing around. This visit to China was the beginning. Then he went to Russia, and the Russians came here, and then he went there, and next thing you know, every week he was on the Time magazine, every week he was on the Life magazine, and he's in the Kremlin, and he's in Peking, and he's this place, and that place, and the whole world was always in the, and it's Kissinger, right? I mean, it was always Kissinger. So what's going on over here? Sadat's problem, as we look at 72 and 73. How to get in with Nixon and win him over to the Arab side. Can it be done? If it can be done, if Israel loses Nixon, what happens next in the Arab-Israeli conflict? What will Nixon do? Stay tuned.